Please be seated. You can be seated.
And in this season of Lent, we're going to be looking at the last week of Jesus. What would you do if you knew you had 1 week left to live? That's a hard question, kind of a downer to be thinking about on a beautiful Sunday morning. But we're looking at the last week of Jesus, and today our story is looking at the story of Lazarus. It actually starts just before the last week of Jesus, but it sets everything up that happens as we continue on in this story. And it's the point where Jesus really makes the decision. There's a turning point in the story in the book of John where everything hinges on what he does here that leads eventually to his death and his resurrection. So this is the prequel. This is the getting ready for things. Now, if I thought about what I would do, if I had 1 week to live, what would I do? People always talk about having a bucket list. You know what a bucket list is? Like a list of things you want to do before you die. And so if you found out, then you would try and do all of these things. And when I talk to people about their bucket lists, there's always like traveling to exotic places or going skydiving. I'm about to die anyways. I don't need to rush it by skydiving. That doesn't sound appealing to me. I really think if I only had 1 week, I would want to spend it with my friends and family. That would be what was most important. I'd want to have a big party and get all of the youth I'd ever worked with together and see them one last time and tell them how much I love them and how much God loved them. That's what I would want to do. But as we look at this story of Jesus and Lazarus, we move into Jesus is coming up with this question of, is he going to go and do something that he knows is really, really dangerous and could get him killed? He'd been very popular, he'd been preaching, but the more popular he got, the more unpopular he got with other people. And he knew that if he went back to Jerusalem, the last time he'd been in Jerusalem and the area around it, he almost got killed. And so he comes to a point of decision. Now, as we look at this story, there's a couple really important things that you need to know ahead of time to understand the context of this properly. Number one, everyone in this story was Jewish, but the family was divided. See, John was writing this book, and John was Jewish. He's writing to other Jewish believers, but the book of John was written late. It was the last of the Gospels that was written. It was written probably after 70 AD, which is when Jerusalem had been destroyed, and the people of Israel once again found themselves scattered all over the world. And in this time, up until this time, most followers of Jesus were Jewish, and they worshipped in the synagogues or the temple. Well, the temple was destroyed at this point, but until the temple was destroyed, many of the times they gathered in the temple courtyards, they gathered in other places that were part of the regular Jewish tradition. But at this point when John is writing, suddenly that wasn't working anymore. The disagreement between those who were following Jesus and those who were following the more traditional ways of Judaism had really begun to clash with each other, and the Jewish believers were being pushed out and having to find their own ways on things. And this is important because if you read the passage, if you read it in most translations, you'll find a phrase repeated again and again in the book of John, and it's, "and then the Jews." And when we read it with our modern ears, it sounds horribly racist, and in fact was used in really horrible ways by the church over the years to kind of, justify a lot of bad treatment of Jewish people. But the context that it was written in absolutely does not allow for that, because the context it was Jewish people talking to other Jewish people about other Jewish people. So the translation that I chose today, the New Living Translation, I think does a better job of translating the original intent of the word. And so it'll often say things like the Jewish leaders or the people in Judea. It's talking about religious groups rather than talking about ethnic groups. And that's important to understand. So two groups of people, all who were Jewish, were disagreeing with each other about the proper way to follow God. And the language that is used here is to divide between those who are kicking us out of their space and those of us who are trying to walk this way of Jesus. Second thing you have to know about this is that the world had ended. When John was writing this, for the Jewish people, the world was over. The temple was destroyed. Their homeland had been burned. No two stones left on top of each other. Everything that they knew and cared about and loved had been uprooted. And he's writing to them in a space where everyone is trying to make sense of how do we follow God when everything we knew about following God was being the people of God. And once again, this wasn't the first time this has happened. This is actually the second or third time that everything had been destroyed. They had gone into exile. The people of Israel had gone into exile. They came back. The temple had been rebuilt. And now the second temple has been destroyed. And once again, they are scattered all over the world. And they're asking questions like, how could God let something like this happen? What does it mean to be a follower of God when God's people are being scattered all over the place? And the temple, that was the place where we met with God, has been destroyed. And John is writing to give them hope and give them understanding of how to live in a situation that seemed hopeless for a lot of people. So knowing those things, now we can understand the story a little bit better. So this story is John chapter 11, and we're going to power through this because it's like 60 verses, but I tried to figure out what to cut, and everything in there referred to other things that were in there. So that's okay. We're going to pull it up and we're going to get through it here. So a man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this." Maybe not the reaction you would expect if someone told you that someone you cared about was sick. You would think they would show a lot of concern, and we'll get to why this is happening here as we continue with the story. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. This is important as we continue with the story. He stayed there for 2 days. And finally, he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." But his disciples objected. Notice they weren't objecting before. Now when he says, "Let's go to Judea," his disciples object. And they say, "Rabbi, only a few days ago, the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again?" And Jesus replied, "There are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read that, I was like, what? Thanks, Jesus. That's so helpful. Okay, what does this even mean? Jesus does this at times. He talks in ways that, he speaks in roundabout ways about things, even to his disciples sometimes. Basically, what he is saying here is there is a time for everything, and if you do it at the wrong time, there is danger, but if you do it in the right time, there is safety. And he's saying, if I am doing this in God's time, if I'm doing this at the time that I'm supposed to, I will be fine. He's not saying everything will be safe. He actually knows that there is a time where he does this that leads to his death, but he's like, basically he's saying, I know when I'm going to die, it's not yet. Not the most comforting answer to the disciples' concerns. So Jesus' life and death are marked by a trust of God and a dependence on the Spirit. Jesus knew as he's going into this season, he knew where this was leading. He knew the dangers that were coming to it, but he was in tune with the Spirit of God that was telling him the time to go and when to stay away. There were other times where people were trying to kill him and he would move away from it and not allow it to happen. But he has a sense here of God's timing is going on. And knowing that God is doing something, he follows it even in the midst of this scary space. Trusting God doesn't always mean we will be protected from danger. This is a hard teaching. Growing up in Sunday school, we liked all of the stories that had the happy ending. I remember growing up hearing the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and, Daniel prays and the lions don't eat him and he gets delivered. And the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where they get thrown in the fiery furnace and they don't burn up because God is with them. But for every story in the Bible where there is a miraculous rescue, there is a story where people are faithful to God and they don't get rescued. And they walk faithfully amongst all of these things. And when we only tell the stories that have the happy endings, when we hit points in our life where things don't go the way we expect them to, we go, whoa, wait a minute, this wasn't part of the deal. But the Bible actually never promises that things will always go well in our life and we will always be protected from danger. In fact, Jesus taught his disciples that if you follow me, you have to take up your cross and die. There is a cost to this. And he said that there will be much trouble in this world. So when we hit times where things are not going well, it's very easy in that to say, well, where is God? But God never promised that he was going to be our magic ATM of goodness. He calls us to follow him, and sometimes following him, we always have blessings, but also when we follow him, there are also difficulties and hard things, and we trust God in both seasons of our life. Then he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up. And the disciples once again get confused because Jesus likes to talk in roundabout ways. And they say, Lord, if he's sleeping, he'll soon get better. This is a good thing. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping. But Jesus meant that Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sakes, he doesn't stop there, Lazarus is dead, and for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe me. Come, let's go see him. And the disciples are mystified at this point. They're like, what is going on? And now Thomas, nicknamed the twin, or Didymus in the Greek, said to his fellow disciples, let's go to and die with Jesus. Well, there's a happy thought. Some interesting things here. This is Thomas. This is the Thomas who, when we talk about in the Bible, usually the story we're telling is about when Jesus was resurrected and everyone, all the disciples are worshiping, and Thomas goes, I won't believe it. I won't believe it until I stick my finger in his hands and in his side. And so we often call him Doubting Thomas. But here, Thomas believes, he doesn't believe enough to believe that when Jesus says they're going to be safe, that they're going to be safe. But he believes enough to say, I'm going to follow him even if it kills me. So understand this, faith ebbs and flows. It's not something you have or you don't. There are seasons of my life where I've been able to access profound faith, even in difficulties. And there are seasons of my life where I've got nothing to hold on to. And I'm just questioning everything. God is constant through that. But if you're in a season now where you have faith, then celebrate that. But if you're in a season now where you're questioning, that's also not the end of the story. We tend to think that people are binary, on or off. Yes, they have faith or they don't have faith. But the same Peter who jumped out of the boat and started walking on water was the same Peter who denied Jesus and said he didn't even know him later on in our story. And so faith ebbs and flows. But when in doubt, stick with Jesus. This is what Thomas does. He goes, I don't know what's going on. We're probably all going to die, but I'm sticking with Jesus. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. So he travels to Bethany, and he finds that Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. This is very significant. You see, in Bible times, they did not have the medical technology we have to be able to tell when someone is alive or dead. You couldn't hook someone up to an EKG to get a heart reading on them. And so people would actually fall into a coma and they would go, oh, they're dead. And they would start preparing them for burial, wrap them up. And we have many stories throughout history as they're carrying the person to go die, they sit up. I'm not dead yet. 3 days was the rule. After 3 days, you knew someone was dead. At 4 days, the body started to stink because it was decomposing. So when Lazarus has been dead 4 days, we know he was really dead. Not just almost dead or sort of dead. He was stinking dead. Now, Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. And when Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Those words, if only. How many times have we said to God, if only that person had gotten better. If only I had kept my job. If only I had gone home a little bit sooner or a little bit later, maybe I wouldn't have been in that accident. And we question the timing of things. And Martha here, she is struggling. She believes Jesus, but she also doesn't see what's going to happen in this situation. So Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. But immediately she jumps into a theological answer on things. Yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. Now, there was an argument within Judaism at the time. Some people believed that there would be a bodily resurrection. Some people believed that there wasn't a bodily resurrection. there was debate about what would happen, but she was of the school that believed in a bodily resurrection. She says, yeah, I know he's going to rise someday. And Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? Suddenly he takes it out of the theoretical distant and says, I'm talking about me. I am the resurrection. What do you believe about me? Yes, Lord, she told him. I have always believed that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. So hear this, God's plan is bigger than we can imagine. Martha had faith. She believed in Jesus. She believed he was the one who had come from God. She knew he could do miracles, but even she didn't really believe that he could bring her brother back after 4 days. I think if she had been there the day before, she would have believed that 3 days he could still do it, because maybe he wasn't fully dead yet. But this is 4 days. Her imagination could not stretch that big. But understand, God's plan is bigger than we can imagine. But even more than that, what Jesus offers is always himself. When he says that there is resurrection life, he's not just even talking about Lazarus being healed today. He's saying, I am the resurrection in life. It's always back to him. He is offering himself. And that's what he offers us when we face situations that we don't understand and that are bigger than we can imagine. Jesus offers himself. He offers his presence and his love and his power. So then Martha returns to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners. And at this time it was traditional. When you had mourners at a funeral, you did it big. Lots of people would come, and oftentimes they would be very loud and wailing, and kind of the bigger production it was seen as the more you loved a person. In fact, some families, if the person wasn't particularly well liked, they would hire professional mourners to come and do a big production and walk around screaming and wailing so that people would know that their family member was loved and respected. So all of these people are there at the house, and Martha slips in and finds Mary and tells her, the teacher is here and wants to see you. So Mary immediately went to him. Jesus stayed outside the village at the place where Martha had met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So they followed her there. So she's running out to see Jesus, and this whole crowd of people is coming in after her. And when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. This is an odd reaction. When you see someone who's mourning and you see other people mourning with them, why would you get angry in this situation? There's a couple different interpretations on why Jesus feels this way here. Some people feel that he was actually angry at the crowd of people following after her because he thought they were being disingenuous in this. And we'll see a little bit more about what that crowd thinks as we continue on in the story. Other people believe he was angry just at this whole concept of death, that someone he cared about has died because he has made this world and it was never supposed to be this way. I can't get inside Jesus' head, and the passage doesn't explain why he was angry here. But what I know is that Jesus felt emotions. He's not this distant God who is just like above it all. He is feeling. And in my own times of loss and pain, and having walked through many other people who have lost people they love, anger is not an unusual emotion to feel in the midst of it. And Jesus felt that too. "Where have you put him?" he asked them. They told him, "Lord, come and see." And then Jesus wept. So we see anger, now we see grief. Both very human emotions happening in the story. And the people who standing nearby said, "See how much he loved him." But some of them said, "This man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying too?" Now I think we know why Jesus was angry, perhaps. Point number one, God is not indifferent to our pain. Even when God's story is bigger than the individual thing we are going through, God is not indifferent to our pain. This is the story that we tell, that God feels our pain with us. He mourns with us. He feels the things that we feel. He understands them because Jesus was fully human and lived out what it meant to be a human being, including all of our feelings and emotions. He cares about us and suffers with us. I had a serious question as I was growing up that often confronted me of where was God when I suffered. I went through abuse as a child, and I wonder, where was God when that happened? How could God allow something like this to happen? What transformed my life was I was going through a season of prayer and counseling and thinking about that season, and the person counseling me asked me to imagine where was God while it was happening. And I got this picture in my mind as I prayed of God there with me, Jesus there with me, holding me, crying with me in that season of pain. Even when God does not stop pain from happening, God suffers the pain with us. This is the Jesus who died for us, who understands our experiences. He is not indifferent. He cares and suffers with us. And that is an important thing to know when the world has ended, that Jesus cares and suffers the loss with us. So Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb. A cave with a stone rolled across it. "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." Jesus goes, "Yup." And Jesus responds, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" So they rolled aside the stone. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of these people standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me." Jesus does this a lot in the book of John. He prays out loud in ways to be heard for other people. He's teaching while he's praying, actually. Then Lazarus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. And Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." So hear this, God's timing is different than ours. If Mary and Martha had their way, Jesus would have healed Lazarus before he died. I often heard this story growing up, and I thought Jesus was kind of a jerk. Because they come to Jesus and said, your friend is sick and he's going to die. And Jesus is like, give it a couple days. I want him to be dead before, so people can see how powerful I am. When you do the math, if it's been 4 days and it takes 2 days to get from where Jesus was to Bethany, that means Lazarus was already dead by the time the message even got to Jesus. So Jesus was not waiting for Lazarus to die. Lazarus was already dead. Jesus is waiting for Lazarus to stink so that people will really believe that he was dead. And he does this because he wants there to be no doubt at all when Lazarus is raised that he was really dead. Now, I'm like, that's 2 days. That's 2 days when Mary and Martha could not be crying and could be rejoicing to have their brother back. But God's timing is different than our timing. And God's plan and purpose is different than our plan and purpose. So he has something even bigger to do here. And so if you're in a season right now where you don't understand what's going on, hold on to these things. You don't have to say, I know what God is doing, because there are so many spaces where things are just beyond what I can understand. But I hold on to this belief that God is good. And even when I don't get what he's doing, he is trustworthy with my life. But his timing for doing things is not set to my schedule and convenience. So many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happening. There was this movement, and they go, okay, 4 days, he brought someone back from the dead. Only God can do this. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And the leading priests and Pharisees called the high council together. What are we going to do? They asked each other. This man performs many miraculous signs. If we allow him to go on like this, soon everyone will believe in him. Then the Roman army will come and destroy our temple and our nation. There had been several uprisings already where Jewish people had said, no, we don't like what the Romans are doing. And they tried to overthrow the Romans, and people got killed. And the Romans had said, if you do rebel one more time, we're burning everything to the ground. And in fact, it happened in 70 AD. Then Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time, said, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't realize that it's better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to be destroyed. He did not say this on his own. As high priest at that time, he was led to prophesy that Jesus would die for the entire nation. And not only for that nation, but to bring together and unite all the children of God scattered around the world. So from that time on, the Jewish leaders began to plot Jesus' death. 2 things here. Number 1, miracles don't force faith. Sometimes we say, if only God would make himself more apparent, if he would just do some big thing. I've often said, if you just tell me, like right across the sky, I am real, and then I will believe. Jesus did something that could only be done by the power of God, and some people responded with faith, and some people still didn't believe and went and tattletaled on him and tried to get him killed. So understand, when we ask God, why don't you be more obvious? Throughout the Bible, God does miracles and people still disbelieve and still disobey. So miracles don't force faith. Here's the next thing. When we use evil's method to try and bring about good, we destroy the good we are trying to protect. The Pharisees here were actually caring. They were saying, we want to protect our people, and if we let this go on, the Romans might invade and kill everybody. So we'll kill Jesus because it's better that we kill him than everybody gets killed. But they tried to use evil's methods to bring about the good of protecting their people. And of course it failed. This is a temptation we face in our own lives. I'm going to use force to get what I want for the own good. I know this is the wrong thing to do, but it'll work out in the long run, so I'm going to do it. Jesus calls us to a higher way, because when we use evil's methods to try and bring about the good, we destroy the good we are trying to protect. And so at this point, Jesus, having restored Lazarus, he goes away, waits a couple days, and prepares to enter Jerusalem, knowing he is going to the city ruled by people that are going to kill him. But he goes anyways, because he knows there is a bigger purpose and a bigger plan than just what is going to happen right now. So next week, we're going to do the story of Jesus entering into Jerusalem, which feels a little bit weird because usually we do that on Palm Sunday. But we've got weeks of stories to go through that happen between Palm Sunday and Easter. So each week we're going to look at a different one. So we get pre-Palm Sunday, which I think is kind of neat because it gives us time to really sit with these stories. But Jesus chose, knowing it would cause him death, to go to Jerusalem. And he did it because of love. As we move into this time at the communion table, and we're going to invite the children that are outside to come on in and join us at this time, we're remembering Jesus' death for us, his love for us, and that there is something more beyond just suffering, because Jesus chose out of love to do something hard for us. Let's pray together. Loving God, we know that you love us. In seasons of pain, it is hard to see you, and it is hard to feel you, and it is hard to believe. And yet you are with us even in times of suffering. Give us the strength to trust when we don't understand what is going on, that your plan is bigger, that your love is more powerful, and that you never leave us, that you suffer alongside us and care for us. Help us to trust in this. Amen. We're going to head into communion now. And as you're coming forward, if there is something on your heart, if there is a burden that you are carrying and you can't see God in the midst of us, just know we have people in the prayer corners, and they would love to pray with you during this time or after the service, to share that burden with you, to pray for you, to help you find God and faith in the midst of whatever you are going through.